Tov. Today's Daf Yomi is Bava Kamma 5, Bava Kamma Hey, but we're going to start on the bottom of 4b, around 10 lines from the bottom, 4b. Give it to me, I'll show you the page. 4b, right here, this column, right where my thumb is. So the Gemara said in yesterday's Daf, we've seen that according to the Mishnah, there are 4 primary categories of damaging, Arba Avos Nezikin. And then we saw that there was Rabbi Oshaya said that there were 13. Now today, at the bottom of Dalam Abayz, the Gemara is going to say that Rabbi Chia says there are not 13 primary categories. There are 24 categories of damagers listed in the Torah, basically. Tan Rabbi Chia Esrim va'arba avos nizikin. There are 24 primary categories of damages listed in the Torah. What are they? Tashlume kefel. If a person has to pay double, if he steals something and then is caught, he has to pay double. Tashlume arba v'chamisha. If a person steals a sheep or a goat, a sheep or an ox, and then he goes out and sells it or steals it, he has to pay 4 or 5 times the amount. If he sells it or slaughters it, he has to pay 4 or 5 times the amount. Ganaf is a thief, and then the thief admits his sin before he was caught. Gazlan is a robber. A robber is somebody who steals by force. Not like a thief is somebody who steals surreptitiously. Eidim Zoman are witnesses who testified falsely about somebody else, and then their whole testimony is impeached because they couldn't have been there at that time. Va'ones, this is a man who assaults a woman. Va'mefata, somebody who seduces the woman. Motzi Shemer, somebody who spreads libelous charges against a virgin. Va'metame, somebody who makes sacred food tameh and therefore makes it unable to be eaten. That's metame. He takes truma and makes it ritually impure, so you can't eat it. Medamea, somebody who takes somebody's truma, somebody takes somebody's chulin and mixes it with the truma so that he can't eat. He takes the truma and he mixes it in the chulin, so now the person can't eat his regular food. Amenasech, somebody who takes the wine and turns it into idolatrous wine. Vahani Tlaser. And then we have the 13 of Rabbi Oshaya, so that's how we get to 24. Rabbi Arba. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Oshaya, my time Otani Hani. Why doesn't Rabbi Oshaya, who has 13 categories, why doesn't he also list these 9 to get to 24? So the Gemara says, Hani b'mamona kamairi b'knasel kamairi. Because my time Otani Hani, b'mamona kamairi b'knasel kamairi. Rabbi Oshaya is not dealing with Kanas, he's dealing with mamona, compensatory. Kanas, as Rashi will say on the top of 5a, is something that's punitive, where the penalty is not related to the amount of the damage that you did. It's more than the amount of the damage that you did, or it's a fixed amount. Unlike money, which is Rashi is going to tell us on the top of 5a. Rashi says. On top of 5a, Rashi says, the Kol HaMasham Yotar Mas Shahizik, anybody who pays more is called a Kanas. So that's punitive. So here we're not talking about, Rabbi Oshaya was only talking about money, he wasn't talking about punitive. So the Gemara says, well, Gana v'Gazlan the B'monahu. What about a thief and a robber? There in the Bryce of Rabbi Chia, he's paying compensatory, and yet it's still included. So the Gemara says, so why doesn't he list that? Gana v'Gazlan the Memona listni. Gemara says, well, hakatani le shomer chinam v'ashol. So he says that is listed because he lists the case of the shomer chinam and the shol. Rashi says the shol is not really specific here. They list the case of the borrower who watches the object for free. Now, technically speaking, he's exempt if it's stolen from him, but if he claimed it was stolen when really it was his own negligence, and then we discover that it really was stolen, then he has to pay for it. So therefore, that would be a case of geneva. Rabbi Chia Nami, meaning to say, if it was, he claimed it was stolen, but it was negligence, and then we discovered it wasn't stolen, but it was negligence, then he'll have to pay. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Chia Nami Atanile Shomer Chinam. So why doesn't Rabbi Chia Va'Shoel? So if that's the case, so according to, basically the point was the Gemara asked, that Rabbi Oshaya lists the Ganaf and the Gazel when he lists the case of the Shomer Chinam and the Shoal. So if that's the case, why does Rabbi Chia have to list it twice? So why does Rabbi Chia list the Ganaf and the Gazel if he already listed the case of the Shomer Chinam? So the Gemara explains that Rabbi Chia draws a distinction. Tani memona da asli ade be'atera v'kotani memona da asli de be'isura. He lists the case of money that he first encountered in a permitted manner, which is the guardian. The guardian was watching it for free, and then the money which he first encountered in a prohibited manner, which is theft. So therefore, Rabbi Chia lists both. We're in the top of 5a. Well, the Gemara asked the question: well, Adam Zolomim, why does Rabbi Chia list the case of the witnesses that were false witnesses? The Memonahu. That's not a case of kinas, because Rashi says there you pay exactly the amount of the damage that you did. So that's memona, that's money. Listening, why doesn't Rabbi Oshaya list that? So the Gemara says, well, Savrok Rabbi Akiva, he follows the position of Rabbi Akiva, who says, Ein Meshaman al Piatzman. He holds like Rabbi Akiva, who says that if the witnesses, the Edom Zomim, admitted themselves, that they came to another court and admitted themselves, then they wouldn't pay. And so therefore, we're going to say that we see from here that he's of the position, since the witnesses, if they admitted on their own, they're going to be exempt. That proves it's not money, it's not compensatory, but it's a kinas. It's a punitive fine, because the principle is moda b'kinas is pater, that one who admits to a kinas penalty is exempt. So from the fact that Rabbi Akiva says that if the witnesses who were convicted of Edom Zomim run away to another court and say, oh, actually, we are Zomimin, they're exempt from paying in the other court, this proves that it's not money but compensatory. And that's who Rabbi Oshaya is ruling like. So the Gemara says, well, once we've established that Rabbi Oshaya is ruling like Rabbi Akiva, so if that's the case, listen, Trey Gavne Shor, he should list two different types of oxen. Listen, because they're two separate laws. Listen, Shor to Isaac Shor. He should list the case of one ox that gores another ox. Listen, Shor to Isaac Adam, and we should list the case of an ox that gores a man, because we know that they're separate laws. Because as we're going to learn from the Mishnah on 33a, the Tanan Rabbi Akiva Omer, Akiva's other position, Aftam Shechavo Ba'Adam, Meshayim B'Moser Nezek Shalem. Because even though in general, an ox that gores another ox pays the first, well, it's still considered a short time. Well, it's still considered an ox that we don't have the foreseeability that it's going to gore. It pays half damages. But if this ox gores another man, we're going to say he pays nezek shalem. But what's that case referring to? It says, tam shechava ba'adam, if the ox gores a man, Mishayim b'moser nezek shalem, means that once you deduct the penalty of the damage that the man did to the ox has to pay the difference up to full damages. So we see that Rabbi Akiva is in the position that there's a distinction between the types of oxen. One ox that gores another ox pays half damages the first time, whereas an ox that gores another man pays full damages. Gemara says, no, the reason why we don't list it as two separate oxen, as two separate cases, is because Hatabre Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva, Tabre Rabbi Akiva with Gazize, Rabbi Akiva broke his fist, so to speak. Meaning to say, Rabbi Akiva himself limits this ruling. How so? The Tanya Rabbi Akiva says, Yacho Aftam Shachava Ba'adam Yeshayim Min Aliyah. I might think that if an ox gores a person, it pays from the aliyah. What does the aliyah mean here? It means that there's two ways you could assess the damage. You could assess the damage that you're paying by the amount. If, let's say, the ox is worth $100 and does $1 million worth of damage, you could say that we're paying the full damage, the up to $1 million, even though the ox itself is not worth the $1 million. That's called the aliyah, the full damage. Or we could limit it. We say you only have to pay the value of the ox. So I might think by a shor muad, we say he pays by the aliyah, but by a tam, generally speaking, it doesn't pay by the aliyah. So we might think this tam pays by the aliyah if it gores a man. So we say it doesn't. It only pays by the maximum. There's a cap on the penalty, the value of the ox itself. So we see from here, Rabbi Akiva saying it's not like a shor amuad, even when it gores another person. So Rabbi Akiva himself limits it. So since Rabbi Akiva himself limits it, therefore it's not listed as two separate categories. The Gemara says, well, ones v'amafativ v'motzi shemra. Well, what about the case of a man who assaults a woman or seduces a woman or does libel on the woman? Those cases are also memona, meaning to say that there's multiple monetary payments there, that there's the 50 silver coins, which he has to pay. That's a kinas, that's punitive. But there's also the depreciation in her value. Before she was assaulted or seduced, she was worth to get a bridal price of a certain amount. But now she's going to get less of a bridal price, and he has to pay that. He has to pay the pagam, her depreciation, and also he has to pay her boshas, her humiliation. So therefore, that should also be included in the category of Rabbi Oshaya. Gemara says, no, the reason why that's not listed is manavshach. Why should we list it? One way or the other, we don't need to list it. Inezek, if it's the damages, Tanaway. He already listed the case of the damages. Rabbi Chia listed the damages. Itzar, Rabbi Oshaya already listed the case of plain damages. If we're talking about the pain that he caused her, Tanile, he listed that. Iboshes, if we're talking about the humiliation that he caused her, Tanile, he already listed that. Ipagam, if it's a depreciation, Hainu Nezek, that's also a case of actual damages. So Ma'is L'chala Meimar, Kanasa, so what's left? That there's the penalty. So Rabbi Oshaya should list it because it's a kanas, but kanas will come Mairi. Well, that's why he doesn't list it, because Rabbi Oshaya is not listing the cases that are just kanas. What about the case what about those cases where he makes the other person's item tameh, or he mixes the truma with the chulin, or he makes the wine idolatry? Why doesn't he list those cases? So the Gemara explains the reason why we're not. By the way, how does he do the menasech? How does he make the wine idolatry? That Rashi says that he takes his friend's wine and he makes a libation for it to idolatry. And that's going to become prohibitive benefit because he does something explicitly on the wine. This is how you make a libation, Hobbs. You stick your hand in the wine and you scoop it up as a way of worshiping idolatry. And if you do that, you make the other person's wine prohibited. So why don't we list that? So Gemara says, Manav Shach. The reason why those cases are not listed is if we're going to say that there's a dispute later on, we're going to have, well, we had this dispute in Gittin. We already had it earlier on 53a in Gittin, whether or not damage that's not seeable, it's not recognizable, whether or not that's going to be considered damage. So if you want to say that damage that's not immediately recognizable to the eye, he has a chain of nicker. If you're going to say damage that's not recognizable is not considered damage, havoi kanasa. We're going to say that's a kanas. That's going to be considered a kanas. That's a punitive damage. And so therefore, kanas will come we're not dealing with kanas. So therefore, well, I skipped on. He has a chain or nicker shmei hezek. If that damage is not recognizable, it's considered damage. It's hatanoi nezek. Well, that's listed. And if it's not damage, then it's a kanas, and the kanas are not referring to. The ishmei hezek, because if you want to say, so if that's the case, the Gemara says, Leima kasava Rabbi Chia, so it must be, so from the fact that Rabbi Chia does list these categories, it must be that he's of the position, Hazek she'eno nikar, lo shmei hazek. It must be that he doesn't consider it damage. The ishmei hazek, because if he would actually consider it damages, why would he need to list it twice? Hatanaway, Nezek. He also listed Nezek already. So from the fact that he's listing it a second time, it must be that he considers that damage is not recognizable, is not damages, but a kanas. Where it says, no, not necessarily. Tana zeka de minkara, mitana zeka de lo minkara. No, he lists, he lists damages that are recognizable. That's one category. And then he lists damages that is not immediately recognizable. Why does he have to list them both? Because to tell you that they're both damages. So then the Gemara says, Bishlam Tana Tidan, it makes sense according to the Tana, the author of our Mishnah, Tana Minyana. He says that there are four primary categories of damages. Why does he say four? Miyute de Rabbi Chia, to tell us he doesn't agree with Rabbi Chia, listed as 13. Excuse me, Lamiyute de Rabbi Oshaya, to tell us he doesn't agree with Rabbi Oshaya, listed as 13. Rabbi Oshaya lists 13 categories of damage. Tana Minyana, he listed specifically as 13, to tell us he doesn't agree with Rabbi Chia, who lists it as 24. Ela Minyana de Rabbi Chia Mai. Why does Rabbi Chia say that there are 24? What's he coming to tell us? So he says, Lamiyute, he's coming to tell us that the case of a Moser, Umefagel, that those cases are not included within the 24, within the primary categories of damage. What's a Moser? Rashi says Moser is a Malshin. This is somebody who says bad things. What does it mean? Shemoser mamon chavero ovekochamim. He goes to the idolaters and tries to get his friend to lose his money. He basically reports on a fellow Jew to the idolaters. And then there's a mefagel. What's a mefagel? Rashi says here that this is a Kohen who sacrificed. You bring a sacrifice to the temple, you give it to the Kohen, and the Kohen has the wrong intent with sacrificing. So he needs to bring another sacrifice. He had to bring a sin offering, and the Kohen brought it for a shlomim. So now he has to bring another one. So those cases are excluded from the count of 24. Yochia doesn't include them as avos nezikin. So the Gemara says, "V'lisnei." Well, why not? Bishlam and mefagel. I understand why he doesn't list the case of mefagel, because that bekachem will kamairi. He's not dealing with sacred offerings, so that's why he's not listing it. Ela moser, my time alo. Why doesn't he list the case of the person who is moser? Gemara says, "Well, shani moser de dibura." Well, there it's just speech. Uba dibura will kamairi. So speech itself is not going to be something that Rabbi Chia is talking about when he talks about the primary categories of damage. He's not talking about damage you did just with your speech. So the Gemara says, "Va'motzi shemra de diburo." But what about the fact that he libels her? He claims she's not a virgin when she really is. If that's just speech, and still Rabbi Chia lists it as one of the 24. So the Gemara says, "Dibura de isbei maisehu." No, there it's a speech, but it's necessary for that speech to have a lot of actions. He has to marry her. He has to be intimate with her. So there it's a speech with an action. And so therefore, that's why he includes it. But just pure speech, like a moser, he's not going to include that in the category of damages. Gemara says, Vaedim zomimim. What about the case of the false witnesses? The dibur the leis b'maisu. The case of the edim zomim, there it's speech and there's no action associated with it. Vikotani, and there it's listed. So why? So we see that Rabbi Chia is listing even things that are just speech. So the Gemara says, well, no, that case, Hasam, Afagav Delays by Maisa, even though that case there's no actual action, nevertheless, Rachmana Karye Maisa, the Torah calls it an action because it says, Vasisem lo kasher zamam lasos lachiv. The Torah calls it an action, even though it's just speech. The Torah calls it an action to tell us it's an action. So the Gemara says, well, Bishlam Tana Didan Tana Avos Mikali Kataladas. It makes sense according to the author of our Mishnah. He says that there are 4 primary categories. It tells us that there are also secondary categories. And what are the secondary categories? The secondary categories we saw it for goring is biting and kicking. We saw that. El Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Oshaya, Avos, but according to Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Oshaya, who say that there are primary categories for all these cases, Mikal the Ikotolados, which means that they all these primary categories also have subcategories. Toldos say in Mainiu, what are the subcategories of the 13 cases of Rabbi Oshaya and the 24 cases of Rabbi Chia? Amar Rabbi Avo, Kulon, no, there are no subcategories here. So why does it say Avos? Rabbi Avo's answer is Kulon ka Avos l'shalami meitiv. No, it's teaching us a separate law about these cases that you have to pay. If you're going to pay from real estate, if you're going to pay him back from real estate, you pay him from the best of the property. That if you have 3 classes of field, class A, B, and C, you have to pay him back from the best. My time. But what's the reason that you pay him back from the best from all these cases? So these words, these 4 primary categories of damage are all written one of these words, tachas, and Rashi goes through all the verses, or the word nesina, or the word yeshalim, or the word kesef. And we're going to say that all of these words appear by one of the other categories that tell us that you pay from the best of the property and not the worst. And so therefore, that's the reason why they're calling them avos, but not because all these cases have tolados. So we can read the Rashi, the Bekul Ksiv, O Tachas, in all, that they're written by all of them. Either it says tachas, so gamrin tachas mishor muad, and we learn out from the fact that it says tachas by a shore that is a muad. They'll say a shore tachas shore, and just like over there, ma hasami meitav, there from by an ox you pay for the best. The gamar mishain v'regel, because we learned that out from tooth and foot, because it says meitav sadeo. So too, avkan meitav. So too, by this case, also from the best. Shem bala shalim karko and nizak. That if you want to pay the damages to the person who is damaged, makbil mina idis, or it says that you pay from the best, or nasina v'gamar nasina mishor shenagach as evan, or you were not. Rashi goes through all of them. So we're not going to read the whole Rashi because it's very long, but that just gives you the flavor of it. And then the Mishnah said that so now we kind of finished like the major introduction to the tractate, but now we're going through but we're still kind of like introducing the whole topic. So the Mishnah says that the characteristics of the shore, the characteristics of the ox are not like the characteristics of the mava. Remember, we saw earlier that what's mava? Rav says mava is a human, and Shmuel says that the human who does damage, and Shmuel says mava is a shane, the tooth that does damage. So what's it saying when it's telling us that the characteristics of the ox are not like the characteristics of the mava? And Micah Amar, what does it mean? Amar, this is what it means. The Torah should have only written either ox or tooth, and we could have learned that one from the other. So you say, no, we can't learn that one from the other because they don't have the same characteristics. And not the ox and the tooth are not, which you can't learn out the fire from it. Because ox and tooth both have animation to it, they're alive. But unlike the fire, which is not alive. So my Kamar, what's it telling us? This is what it means. We're on the top of 5b. The Torah could have written down ox and tooth, and we could have learned out v'teisi idach minai, and we could have learned out fire from it, because we should have been able to learn out fire by just having the case of the tooth and the mava and the ox. Mara says hadar amar, no. Then the Mishnah says chadami tarti lo asi. No, we couldn't have learned out fire from tooth and mava from ox and mava, because ox and mava have ruach chayim and fire doesn't have ruach chayim. So amar Rava v'kulu kishadis bar binayu, and in all of these cases, when you have the case of the pit amongst them, v'kulu kishadis bar binayu, if the Torah had written it that same av, in addition to it, had written the case of the pit, as yakulu b'ma'atzad. If the Torah had written that one av, and in addition to it, had written the case of the pit, as yakulu b'ma'atzad, we should have been able to learn all of these avos nezikin from the common denominator with pit, bavad mikaren, with the exception of goring. Why? Mishum de iko mifrach, because we could have challenged all of those from. If we had written anything with pit, we should have been able to learn out the third one except for goring, because the goring has a separate law which doesn't appear by all the other cases. Why? Shekain the iko mifrach, because we could have said in all these other cases, ma'al kulu shekain muadin mitchilasin. In all these cases, they are a muad from the outset, meaning to say all these other cases, let's say pit, tooth, man, fire, the first time you do the damage, the first time the damage is done, you have to pay full damages. Whereas goring, the first time you do the damage, it's only half damages. So therefore, you can't learn out goring from these other cases. Well, Manda Amar, according to the one who says just the opposite, Adarabba, just the opposite, Karen Adifa, Shekavanaso Ahazek, according to the position who says that no, that goring is not less severe because you pay half damages, but it's more severe because goring is a case where you intend to do the damage, and so therefore, since you intend to do the damage, therefore it's more severe But Rashi says something very specific here. Rashi says, "Lo is parashecha." I don't know where this position is recorded, where this Manda Amar who says that goring is stricter because it's intended to do damage. But Rashi says, I don't know where it is. If Rashi doesn't know, I don't know. But other commentaries, later commenters, try to figure it out. So I feel Karanami Asya, according to this approach, also goring should you could derive from the fact that you just have pit and one other case. So if that's the case, since all of them didn't need to be written, why did the Mishnah or why did the Torah write all four of these primary categories of damage? So that we have to say, why did the Torah write all these cases? Because they each have separate halachos by each of these categories. And now we're going to say the separate halachos by each of these categories. Karen, what's goring? We're drawing a distinction between if the animal was the first time before it becomes a shor muad, well, it's still a time. If it gores, you pay half damages. And if it's a muad, it pays full damages. If it's gored 3 times, it pays full damages. And a shein verega, why does it say the case of tooth and foot? But pochum b'rishus haramim, that if they gore in the public domain, with your, if it's not gore, if you trample on the public domain or if the ox eats somebody else's produce in the public domain, it's going to be exempt. They're only responsible if it's in the other person's category. Bor, why does it have to list the case of the pit? Liftor boas hakelim. So if your utensils fall into, if you dig a pit in the public domain and somebody's utensils falls into it, you're not going to be responsible. So that's the exemption of a bor. You're only responsible for damage due to an animal, but not due to the utensils. So Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda, the mechayev on this kekelim bebor. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says you are liable for the damage done to a utensil with your pit, liftor bo as adam. So it's to tell us that if a person falls into a pit, you're going to be exempt from the damages. The owner of the pit will be exempt. Because it says, in the verse, it says, Gam Shor. It says, this, we're going to get to this on 53b. Again, this is still part of the introduction. And why do we have to say the case of the Adam? What is the case of the person? Teach us. It's to tell us that you're not only responsible for damages, but if a man does a damage, he also has to pay pain, tsar, ripoy, medicine, sheves, lost wages, uboshes, emotional distress. And Aish, why does it have to list the category of fire? Liftar boas atamun, to say the special law of fire is if that there was something that was covered up when you sent the fire out of your property, this other person's property, which it destroyed, the thing that would destroy was covered up on his property, you're not going to be liable. Or Rabbi Yehuda, the mechayev on this case, tamam be'esh. According to Rabbi Yehuda, says you are liable even if it was covered up. So if that's the case, be'esh l'suyemai, what's it coming to say when it says the case of fire? Suye lichko niro v'sichaka avana. That is to tell us, to include that you're going to be liable even in a very insignificant damage. Like, for example, if the ground was just singed, or if the stone was just a little bit singed, and therefore it ruined it. So therefore, even though the damage is not so recognizable, you're going to say that he is liable under those circumstances. Okay, this is the Geshmak Daf for today, and God willing, we'll go over this again at 8 a.m. Hopefully you can join us a second time.